I didn't grow up wanting to be a coroner. No kid does, I guess, really. I actually wanted to be a doctor, but since I didn't have the grades for medical school and I still wanted to turn my love of anatomy into a career, I decided being a coroner was my best bet. Now, for those that are unaware of what a coroner does, I'll just break it down Barney style. Whenever someone dies, and we aren't super duper sure how they died, it's my job to take a look under the hood, as we say, and figure it out. I used to work in the city, and for quite a while too, but I feel like a man in my line of work can only work in a city for so long before he either quits, moves elsewhere, or loses his mind completely. Me, I decided to move elsewhere, somewhere quiet and calm, which is how I ended up in Mikalsen, Montana. It's a pretty little town on the edge of a bay, and with just 5,000 people living here, it's considerably quieter than my previous home of almost 4 million. Now back there, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for me to complete 3 or 4 post-mortems in a 24-hour period. Now, I'm lucky if I see maybe 3 or 4 a year. And as you can probably imagine, that suits me just fine considering that I only took a minor salary hit. But then I guess, ironically, it's here that I performed the most memorable autopsy of my entire career. And it's one of those that's memorable for all the wrong reasons and why I sent you the story. Now, one morning, I got a call from a deputy sheriff to tell me that a young girl had passed away. And from the moment I heard his voice, I knew that this one was going to be different. She'd been found the previous night, wandering on the 35 in her bare feet. The driver that spotted her turned around to see if she needed any help, and found a young girl on death's door. She looked terrible, starved and beaten, and was mumbling all kinds of gibberish till she eventually passed out. The driver tried to keep her awake and talking, and then when he realized that she was probably slipping away, he even tried performing CPR. But unfortunately, the poor thing passed away before the emergency crews could get to her. Naturally, the sheriff's department wanted to know exactly what killed her, but more importantly, they wanted to know if I thought that there was also a who element to it, as in, was it a tragic accident, or was it murder? But when the girl's body arrived at my office, I found that there were many more questions to be asked, and some very frightening ones too. And when it came time for the autopsy, the forensic pathologist I work with agreed that he'd never seen anything like it. At 5'7", the girl appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, but she didn't weigh an ounce over 70 pounds. She was also this very sick shade of yellow, which indicated liver and kidney failure, but that wasn't even the half of it. She'd quite clearly been starved, and her body was so heavily covered in burns and scars that it seemed her abuse had been almost systematic. Like someone had been trying to slowly disfigure her, one patch of flesh at a time. We discovered the girl's eyes had actually been gouged out, and that her finger and toenails appeared to have been completely and deliberately removed. There was also evidence someone had tried to either torture or sterilize her by piercing her abdomen with some hot wires or needles. The technicians collected swabs and samples, and then the pathologist proceeded to cut that old distinctive Y shape into the chest of the deceased. And the effects of her starvation were evidence of the girl's organs, yet bizarrely we found quite a sizable amount of partially digested organic material in her lower digestive tract. Now, this, along with samples of her blood and spinal fluids, was tested at our on-site laboratory, and what our technicians found was truly shocking. The contents of the girl's stomach turned out to be a mix of 2 very distinct varieties of fungi, fly agaric and the suitably named death cap. Now, the death cap needs no introduction, as I'm sure you know. It does what its name suggests. Some might say that fly agaric is also suitably named because while ingesting it won't make you fly, it does have intense hallucinogenic effects on those who use it. The implications of its presence terrified us. And when it came to writing up the post-mortem, we almost didn't want to believe our own conclusions. Judging from the bruises around her wrists, ankles, and neck, someone had kept the girl prisoner, and the level of starvation suggested this had been for a considerable amount of time. During this period, She had been systemically tortured and maimed by someone exceptionally sadistic. Then, once she was hungry enough to eat just about anything put in front of her, the girl's captor fed her a fatal mix of mushrooms and just let her go. Even if she was still in possession of her sight, we judged the girl was far too weak to have mounted any kind of serious escape attempt. So either something inconceivable occurred and she wandered free from captivity, or her captor deliberately set her free. She spent her final hours wandering through the woods in what must have been complete confusion and unimaginable agony. It was the single most horrifying postmortem I've ever had the displeasure of overseeing, but it raised the question, just who the hell was evil enough to inflict such an ordeal on an innocent young woman? Once our examination was complete and the final report written up, the girl's body was transported to a local funeral home. Our official conclusion was that the girl had been murdered via poisoning, and there were comorbid factors of starvation and historical physical abuse. And this led to a murder investigation being opened, but sadly, it's one that's never been closed. I've overseen many, many postmortems in my time as a coroner, and there have been more memorable ones that I care to count. But not one of them haunts me, and I mean truly haunts me like that poor young woman who spent her final few hours on this earth blind, terrified, and wandering around alone in the middle of nowhere. Ever since I can remember, I've always been into post-apocalyptic movies and TV shows. That's no exaggeration either. The first movie I ever remember watching was a Peter Graves one from the 70s called Where Have All the People Gone? It's about a mysterious natural disaster, a solar flash that turns like 90% of people into ash and leaves everyone else to wander this deserted, dead landscape. If I watched it nowadays, I'd probably think it was pretty lame, but back then, it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. I mean, Mad Max was awesome too, but the idea of people disappearing seemed like it'd be sort of strangely peaceful. Now cut to about 15 years later, and I don't have to look far to understand my fascination with abandoned places. And throughout the summer of 1996, me and my buddy Stan started ticking off as many Texas ghost towns as we possibly could. We visited Mesquite over in Borden County, and then we hit up Best and Reagan and Langley over in Valverde. We'd walk around, take pictures, drink a few beers, and then drive back home once we were back under the limit again. And you might think once you've seen one abandoned town, you've seen them all, but that couldn't be any further from the truth. Each one has something unique to offer. It's just that sometimes that thing isn't always good. So after Langley, me and Stan started looking up other places to visit. It wasn't easy back then. We didn't have access to the internet to just look these things up. So when Stan found a place, he called me up, excited as hell, and told me all about a little place called Lobo. Apparently water was found in the area back in the mid-1800s, and it became a watering hole for pioneers heading west. A railroad depot was established a few years later under the designation Lobo because of all the wolves that roamed around the area, and that's how the town got its name. By the late 20s, the town had almost 30 permanent residents, but more than 100 railroad workers that were stationed around the depot too. There was a hotel, a general store, and a bunch of other businesses. And then came the earthquake. Well, 2 earthquakes, and then the wells ran dry. Stan said that, and he swore this was no word of a lie, a guy called William Christ bought the whole place in the 60s. He opened up a general store and a gas station in the hopes of reviving the place and offered discounted rents to anyone who'd come live there. But then, weirdly enough, there was a weird kind of crime wave around Lobo, and then a bunch of Bill Christ's businesses all burned down one night, and he abandoned the place. That was 1991, meaning by 1996 the place had been abandoned for 5 years. But unlike a lot of other places, almost every building in Lobo was still standing. In fact, I'd say it was the most complete abandoned town we'd ever visited, and the closest I'd ever been to recreating the stuff I saw in Where Have All the People Gone. As you can imagine, I was absolutely over the moon, and so was Stan. It was like we'd walked straight onto the set of some post-apocalyptic survival movie. But little did we know, it was about to become part horror movie too. Because after walking around for no more than a few minutes, me and Stan had heard a sudden scream. It might sound dumb, but at the time, I looked at him and asked if he'd set it up. Like he'd, I don't know, paid someone to stop by and scare the crap out of me by unleashing some blood-curdling scream. But I turned to him, and the look of fear on his face told me all I needed to know. Since we'd heard Lobo was popular with urbex enthusiasts, some people who also appreciate abandoned places, we figured some other group had run into trouble, some obviously painful trouble by the sounds of things. So we did what we'd want anyone else to do if that was us in that situation, which was run to help. We ran in the direction of the screams, then as we got closer, we heard the sound of someone else cursing. I don't know about Stan, but I thought it sounded like whoever he was with trying to calm him down. He'd fallen, broken his leg, and his buddies telling him to keep quiet so he can concentrate. But it wasn't that at all. Stan yelled out, "Hang on, we're coming," at which point the person screaming started yelling, "Please help me," and all sorts of stuff. And we heard the other voice again too, and right away, I realized that we might have misjudged the situation. Something didn't sound right about the way that he was talking, but I could barely hear him over the screams. So I also didn't stop running because both me and Stan were still under the impression someone needed help. Well, they did. There was just no way that we could save them because the people making him scream found me and Stan before we could find the person needing saving. We didn't see the guy, we just saw some 6-foot monster wearing gloves and a crowbar, and then another guy, smaller, yelling at the bigger guy to get us. Now we turned on our heels and then sprinted all the way back to the car with that huge guy on our tail. But thanks to him being such a muffin, we were able to safely outrun him, and last time we saw him, he was in our rear view as we drove off. We called the cops from some gas station and then drove with some deputy all the way back to where we'd been so he could see exactly what we were talking about. We didn't expect anyone to be there when we got back, and we were right on that. But what was left was a lot of blood. We think someone was being tortured. Maybe for information, maybe just revenge, and the people who orchestrated it were obviously some very shady people. If they were killing someone out there, they'd do it just before fleeing, right? So it had to be torture, and just writing that out gives me chills. It was the first time that we'd run into anything like that while touring some abandoned places, and while it wasn't the last, nothing ever quite compared to the insanity that happened that day in Lobo. You might find this a very unusual submission, but I think it's one that you and your viewers might enjoy, and while I'd prefer to remain anonymous, I can assure you that it's actually genuine. Now, without giving you my entire life story, I grew up in the United Kingdom, but my parents are Greek and Iranian. They met in London after emigrating, worked hard to make a life for themselves, and then had me. They pushed me to do well in school, consoled me when my attempts to become a footballer failed, and then were pleased as punch when I was accepted into Oxford University to study Greco-Persian history. Dad liked the idea of me staying in academia. Mom agreed, but thought that I should study medicine. Yet not long after I graduated, I got a letter from an institution known as the Government Communications Headquarters, who invited me to attend a job interview. Now, to the untrained ear, Government Communications HQ might sound rather boring, but let me assure you, it is not. That's because GCHQ is responsible for providing signals and intelligence to the government and armed forces of the United Kingdom. It was first established after the First World War, then during the Second, it worked on breaking German Enigma codes out of Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire. Now, getting hired by them didn't make me some glorified IT guy. It made me, for all intents and purposes, a spy. And I later found out that I'd been headhunted by the recruitment team while I was at university, partially because of my academic and sporting performance, but mainly for my language skills. I spoke a little bit of Greek, but my mom's side of the family were very involved when I was a kid, so while I wasn't completely fluent in Farsi, I knew much more than most about Persian language and culture and could easily pass as Iranian. And this made me an ideal candidate to spy on the Islamic Republic. So for the first 18 months of my career, I trained for that. But then, on a sunny afternoon, UK time, in September of 2001, 19 hijackers changed the course of history, as you know. And after the towers fell, and W told New York how the world was about to hear them, my department's focus shifted from Iran to Afghanistan. But seeing as the two countries have very similar languages, in Dari and Farsi, it made me a highly rated asset, and one that was itching to be deployed. Now, less than 2 weeks after the attacks, I was sitting in a briefing room going over the details of the assignment that I'd been given. London to Cyprus, Cyprus to Turkmenistan, and then from there, I'd transformed myself from a British civil servant to an Iranian journalist before taking a taxi over the border into Afghanistan. Now, my destination was the ancient city of Herat, where I'd gather intelligence on Taliban morale and troop numbers prior to what was undoubtedly going to be an American-led invasion. While in Herat, I learned that many Taliban fighters had been sent to the mountains around 30 miles southeast of the city. There, they were digging in, stockpiling munitions, and preparing to resist coalition forces. So, that's where I went. I was advised to hire a guide to escort me through the wilderness and towards the mountains. I didn't want to get lost, but neither did I want to attract too much attention to myself. So I hitched a ride to a small village within 2 days' walk of the mountains, then did just that. Walked. Getting up into those mountains made for the toughest hike of my life. Then following one particularly grueling climb, I was relieved to see a gently sloping valley that led deeper into the mountains. It was beautiful in its way, like a little slice of Shangri-La. But as I looked around, I suddenly spotted 2 men standing on a ridge some distance behind me. They were little more than specks all the way up there, but I could tell that they were watching me, and I remember thinking to myself, I'd be in a terrible spot of bother if one of those chaps had a rifle. As I walked further and further away from them, and the valley stayed nice and quiet, I started to relax. I started thinking that they were just 2 curious shepherds. But no sooner had that thought entered my head, the first bullet struck the rocks about 50 meters away from me. It was terrifying, impossible to put words into in a way, and I've never felt anything like it. There was nothing ahead of me but open ground, so all I could do was run as fast as I could and hope the gunman was just some goon with an AK and not an expert marksman. Because if he was, I was dead. And the first bullet landed about 50 meters away in a spray of dust and gravel, but when the second hit, it was even closer. It landed no more than 20 meters ahead of me after whizzing over my head. And the next was closer still, landing just within arm's reach. But by then, I had made it to a grouping of large rocks that I could bound between to put something solid between me and those bullets. And eventually I was faced with a stretch of open ground leading up to a gentle ridge, and I waited to see if another shot came, and then when I was met with only silence, I ran for the ridge, praying the gunman had given up and wasn't just reloading. But no more bullets were fired. It was a relief to be on the other side of the ridge, knowing I was totally out of sight, but I knew that I still wasn't safe. The gunman and his pal could be pursuing me, or there could be additional assailants waiting ahead. And with no choice, I pushed on as fast as I could until I suddenly spotted a plume of smoke rising in the distance. It wasn't until I got much closer that I realized that it was a tea house, and that was another huge relief, because with the sun beginning to set, it was an ideal place to bed down for the night. Most Afghan tea houses serve tea and simple meals, but many feature side rooms or second floors that function as guest houses. Guests are packed into one large room with nothing but a mat to sleep on, so it's not exactly the Ritz, but they serve as a wholesome shelter for travelers during the longer, colder nights and when the passes are blocked by winter snows. I drew some stairs after making my way inside, but after the owner rather loudly asked where I was from, my cover story seemed to lessen the tension. There was a clear interest in me, but I was left to eat and drink in peace. After a few hours of nursing cups of tea and talking with fellow travelers, I approached the tea house's owner regarding accommodation for the night. I was directed to a back room where, just as I expected, several other men sat on their sleeping mats which were placed around the room. The walls were bare, the floor was covered in a mosaic of carpets, and there was a large silver tea set in the middle of the room. But what really grabbed my attention was the Kalashnikov that sat in one man's lap. Some of the men seemed to recognize me from the tea house's main room and greeted me before telling the others who I was, or rather, who I wasn't. I ran with my cover and began asking their thoughts on Al-Qaeda, the United States, Osama bin Laden, while writing notes in Farsi shorthand on a notepad. They bought my story wholesale, and in line with Afghan hospitality customs, they promised to do their utmost to look after me during my stay. But then, after one of them asked me how my stay in Afghanistan had been, I couldn't help but mention the unfortunate shooting incident which had occurred earlier that day. Some of the men tutted and shook their heads, muttering "Badmashi," which means like criminals or gangsters. But as I described how the distant shots had come out of nowhere and I'd rushed forward into cover, I noticed the man with the gun shared a very sheepish look with another man sitting next to him. The Afghans pride themselves on being good hosts, so I initially confused the look with one of embarrassment. But when I finished my story, you can imagine my shock when the man with the rifle basically said, "Sorry, that was me." He did it in a very long-winded, very Afghan way, with a "I shot at someone today, but it couldn't have been you," becoming "It might have been you," and ending with "It was probably you, and I'm sorry." And to understand how surreal this was for me, you have to understand the manner in which this man was apologizing to me. If I almost killed a man, if I almost orphaned his children and widowed his wife, I'd beg his forgiveness. Not just because he could quite easily have me imprisoned, but because I'd have robbed him of his most precious possession, his life. But that is a very Western mindset, because there are places in the world where human life is not nearly so highly valuable. And so when I say that the man apologized to me in a way that you might do after bumping someone's trolley in a supermarket, I say it sincerely. To him, his shots didn't hit me because God didn't let them. If I was favored by God, then I must be all right. But why shoot at me in the first place? And when I asked the man, he said that it was for two reasons. The first being that I was quite obviously a foreigner. This utterly confounded me, as I'd spent months preparing and was kitted out in authentic and well-worn Afghan attire. Yet according to the gunman, he knew that I wasn't Afghan because, and these are his words, I didn't walk like it. And then since there was a good chance that I was some kind of American infiltrator, not far off, boys, the gunman decided that there was no harm in shooting at me. He says this to his companion, but his companion laughs and then says something to the effect of, "You'll never hit him at his distance, you're a terrible shot," to which he replies, "Oh yeah? Watch me." It was a bet. I was nearly shot and potentially killed over little more than a bet. The perpetrators were deeply apologetic and claimed that they'd never have shot me if they'd known that I was an Iranian Muslim, but it was still a very strange and very bitter pill to swallow that I'd nearly been killed to prevent a man losing face. And it was also a reminder that if they found out who I really was, I'd be in a hell of a lot of trouble. So instead of showing what I really felt, which was a mix of terror and relief, I acted calm as you like and told them God obviously had a plan for me. And both men were very pleased by my veneer of fatalism. But it was just that, a cover, as deep down I was more frightened than I'd ever been in my entire life. Yet thanks to my training, I'd learned not to show it. The group and I talked until the wee small hours of the morning, and I made notes on anything and everything pertinent. The two men even offered to walk me further up the mountains so I could reach Taliban positions in safety, but I departed before the call to dawn prayers while everyone was still asleep. I reached the Taliban positions, conducted a few interviews with their lieutenants and commanders, and all without having my cover even close to being blown. And then just a few weeks later, American B-52s were dropping bombs on them, all based on my intelligence reports. And I sometimes think about that tea house and I hope it survived the American bombing. One day, God willing, I can go back there and be a traveler under some very different circumstances. On the rare occasion that someone asks me what I do for a living, my reply always prompts the same response every single time. I say, I'm a limnologist. Then they say, what the heck is that? So, in as few words as possible, I'm a scientist, and I study freshwater, meaning anything from lakes to ponds to reservoirs, and my job is to understand how they work as ecosystems. I'll measure how deep they are, I'll check their chemical composition, as well as taking notes of what lives in them, and if applicable, how it all changes with the seasons. I guess I'm a nerd for water, but I love my job for another reason, and that's all the field work I get to do. I've always been happier outdoors than indoors, so the fieldwork side of things was a big appeal when it came time to apply for jobs. I'm a regular visitor to national parks, but sometimes my work takes me out to some very remote places that are far from the beaten track. I'm talking lakes tucked away behind miles of logging roads, or ponds that are so deep in the backcountry that there's no cell service or gas station for miles and miles around. Now, once I arrive at my site, I'll haul my equipment from my truck, the depth sounders, water samplers, and oxygen probes, and then I'll take measurements of temperature and oxygen at different depths to build what we call a profile. It can be pretty lonely work, and obviously that has its own set of downsides. But then came one day when I learned that sometimes alone is better. So on the day in question, I had been out on the lake all morning pulling up sediment cores. These are really long, heavy cylinders full of mud from the lake's bottom, and analyzing them layer by layer can tell you the story of the lake's past. It was one of those remote southwestern lakes, Lake Walker in Nevada to be exact, where the road just kind of gives up points and turns into gravel. No one goes out there unless they've got a reason, and since there are a few good reasons to be out at some muddy lake in the middle of the desert, I thought I was alone. And by the time I got the last course sealed and logged, my arms felt like they were just about ready to fall off, and with the sun starting to dip behind the tree line, it signaled the end of my day's work. I sort of trudged back up the path to where I'd parked the truck. In it was my old field rig loaded with gear, data sheets, and a cooler full of samples. It was expensive gear too, so much so that it'd be cheaper to replace me than it would be my equipment. And so you can imagine my horror when I finally spotted my truck and saw that the driver's side window had been smashed in. I ran, convinced that some meth head had stolen tens of thousands of dollars worth of specialist equipment, and I could already see him flipping it for a few $100 and then smoking or injecting months of work into his lungs or veins. And then by the time I was terminated from my job, denied what I believed was my life's purpose, he'd already be robbing his next victim. I was catastrophizing, I suppose, these hypotheticals, panic-stricken at the idea of all that work amounting to nothing. But while I found a heck of a lot of glass all over the seats, there was nothing missing. In fact, rather than steal from me, whoever broke my window had only added things, not taken them away. Because underneath the windshield wiper, pinned in place by the plastic, was a torn scrap of cardboard on which was written, "We left you a gift." And by all estimates, my window had been broken by the fist-sized rock which now lay on the passenger's seat, and looking at it, I figured that was my gift. I distinctly remember being terrified that someone was about to step out of the nearby tree line, someone who'd been watching and waiting to give me more of their gifts. But thankfully there was no one. And then after sweeping all the broken glass from off my seat, I started on the long drive back to the dirt road that'd take me toward the highway. By the time I was moving again, I'd calmed down a little, but by then I was also just mad. I mean, who the hell sees a stranger's truck parked in the middle of nowhere and their first thought is, I'm gonna smash it? I figured it was probably just some dumb teenagers, bodies of men, the minds of children, with mile-wide cruel streaks to boot. And then as I considered the probability of the cops being able to catch them, I felt something moving against my leg. I thought maybe a fly might have gotten into the truck, so I sort of just jerked my leg a little to get it off of me. But the feeling didn't stop, and I realized that whatever it was way bigger than any fly. I then remember taking my eyes off the road and looking down at my leg, and that's when I saw what was crawling up it, and my heart nearly stopped in my chest. It was a bark scorpion, one of the most venomous in all of North America. That was my gift, not the rock, and despite my education and IQ, I hadn't realized until it was way too late. Every instinct told me to slam on the brakes and jump out, and try to bat it off my leg, but I was doing 60 down some winding road with one with no shoulder to speak of. I just remember gripping the wheel so hard that my hands hurt afterwards as I forced myself to breathe, and when they say that time slows down in those sorts of situations, I didn't know how true that really was until those moments. Each second stretched out like a rubber band as I watched that scorpion slowly crawl up my leg, and as each one slipped by, I watched the scorpion edge closer and closer to my groin. I managed to ease off the gas, signal, and roll to a stop on a narrow gravel turnout. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest as I shifted into park, and then I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened my doors smoothly and slowly as I could. I stepped out one leg at a time, and then after raising the fabric from off the skin of my thigh, so as if it sort of stung it would penetrate my skin, I began to shake my pants till the scorpion fell and hit the ground. I practically jumped back into my truck and slammed the door again, but when I did, I was hit by this wave of relief and spent the next few minutes with my head in my hands. I don't think that I've ever been so terrified in all my life, and to this day, I struggle to think of a time where I felt more panic-stricken. It wasn't even so much the scorpion, because while people have died after being stung by bark scorpions, those deaths are very rare. It was the idea of trying to keep my car on the road when my legs felt numb and I went into convulsions. Then if another truck or car drove by, and I might as well have finished that day in several more pieces than I started. I told the guys back at the office about what happened. I needed no encouragement to file a police report because God knows I didn't want whoever left that scorpion in my car to get away with it. But I also knew that there was a very slim chance anything would come out of it, so I wasn't surprised when months turned into a year and I didn't hear back from the cops in Nevada. To this day, I sometimes catch myself wondering who the hell would do something like that and why, but I think deep down, I know. My grandpa used to say some folks were born with the devil in them, and while I have a more scientific explanation, it doesn't make it any less digestible. Some people are just bad, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. More than 20 years ago now, way back during the summer of 2002, I received some of the worst news of my entire life. My favorite aunt, Janie, who I'd been very close with after Mom died when I was young, had suddenly and tragically passed away. It was devastating, but perhaps even more so because it came at a very inopportune time for me. I guess no death comes as a quote-unquote good time, but Aunt Janie died as I was going through a series of bitter financial struggles. I moved across the country a few times before to pursue my dream of, I guess that's not entirely relevant, but let's just say that it wasn't going well, and I barely had 2 quarters to rub together. I couldn't afford a flight, and I really didn't want to leave my car alone for days because it had almost certainly been stolen by the time I got back. And so, not wanting to miss the funeral for fear of forever regretting it, I decided that I was going to drive almost 3,000 miles from Newark, New Jersey to my hometown of Sacramento, California. And sometimes when I look back on it, I wonder what in the world I was thinking, embarking on a 6,000-mile round trip. But at the time, it made perfect sense. I hated living in Newark so bad that I'd have done anything to get away for a while. Now, nothing against the city itself, it's not nearly as bad as some people make it out to be, but my living arrangements left much to be desired, and for multiple reasons, too. I also figured that since I hadn't really seen much of the country I lived in, it was a great excuse for a road trip. Then, and this is probably the craziest part, I figured that I might buy an RV while back in California, assuming that I got some inheritance money, and I'd drive that back to Jersey instead. And like I said, I'm not really sure what I was thinking, but my idea of that road trip and the reality of it would turn out to be very different. On the third day of my journey, I'd reached the western side of Wyoming. I just stopped in a little town called Lyman for a light lunch and then planned to stop for gas in a place called Evanston before crossing over into Utah. But after maybe 45 minutes of being on the highway, I spotted a small town on the horizon, one that I was pretty sure not Evanston. Now I remember slowly as I reached the town limits while thinking, well, might as well top off my tank here if possible, and I started looking around for a gas station. But then, rather than wasting time driving around in circles, I figured that I'd just ask someone for directions. The place had an old-timey vibe about it, and a bunch of stores had signs that looked like they were in Swedish or maybe German. And then aside from a couple of rundown houses, it was honestly picturesque. People looked friendly, it had that wholesome small-town feel to it, so I didn't think twice about rolling down my window and asking a passerby for some pointers. Now, the first person I spotted was a middle-aged woman walking along the sidewalk carrying a few shopping bags. I called out to her, and she walked over to my window, and then after a nice welcoming to the town, she told me that the gas station was almost smack bang in the middle of things, not far from town square. I thanked her and told her how pretty her town was, and she said that I was welcome, but then as I was driving off, she did something very out of the ordinary. She pointed her fist at me, with her index and pinky fingers raised, and then said what sounded like thin and gangly. She said it with a smile, and then turned her back and walked off. So at the time I figured it was little more than just like some harmless idiosyncrasy. And I also figured that I hadn't heard her correctly because there was no way that she said thin and gangly. It had to be something else. But then, what was up with that sort of devil horns rock gesture she made too? And as I drove toward the town square, I figured that I was probably just overthinking things. Maybe she had arthritis and couldn't make a whole fist while pointing. And then, whatever she said, the smile on her face suggested it probably wasn't mean or rude or whatever. And so with that in mind, I continued on towards the town square and the gas station. When I arrived, the gas station's pumps looked like they were from the 60s, and a smiling attendant had to walk out from the station to give me advice on how to use them. He was friendly about it, but he clearly took a great deal of amusement in seeing a millennial like me struggling to use something so outdated. Now, once I was done, I walked inside to pay him. I made a little small talk as I took my change, realizing that I hadn't seen any signage outside of town, so I didn't know what it was called. And the guy kind of chuckled, shook his head, and said, "Damned kids." But he never mentioned the town's name as he went back to reading his paper. I figured he probably wasn't the conversational type, so I just thanked him and turned and began walking back to my car. But as I did, I heard that weird phrase spoken a second time. Now, from behind me, I thought I heard the attendant say, "From thin and gangly." And he said it in the same way as you'd tell someone, "See you later." Now, I then said back, "Sorry, what did you say?" But not in a sort of confrontational or demanding way. I was just sure to stay as courteous as I could. But instead of explaining himself, the guy simply said it a second time. Only that time, he said it so slowly that I could hear exactly what he was saying. "Von hinnen gangen." He didn't just repeat himself, though. He said it aggressively, almost like it was a warning. And if it was a warning, it was one that I didn't need to be given twice. I walked straight back out to my car, intent on getting the hell out of town. Something weird was going on, and I suddenly felt very unwelcome. When I stopped at some lights at the edge of the town square, I noticed someone gesturing to me from the sidewalk off to my left. He was waving gently and had a smile on his face, but by then I was so wary that I wasn't convinced his intentions were pure. I waved back cautiously, and then he started moving his fist in a circle as if to say, "Roll your window down." I didn't roll it down completely. Like I said, I was still kind of wary, but as soon as he saw the gap in the glass, he started pointing at me with his index and pinky finger, just like that lady did before yelling out, "Von hinnen gangen." I rolled my window up again, wondering what the hell I was thinking and rolling it down a little. The lights were still on red, so I had to just sit there and keep calm till they turned green. But in the meantime, the guy kept on yelling that weird phrase at me as loud as he could, and that wasn't even the weirdest part. There were people walking past him, a lot of them too, but they were either completely ignoring the guy, like he was sort of invisible or something, or they just sort of looked on and smiled at his outbursts, while some of them were even laughing to themselves as they passed. I was actually kind of dumbstruck for a second, so as the guy yelling started walking towards my window, all I could do was watch him and wonder if he was crazy or if something else was happening, something I couldn't explain so easily. But when he slammed his fist into my window, I was dragged out of that dumbstruck stupor. I began yelling at him to get the hell away from my car, but as I did, the car behind started honking since the lights had turned green. I just drove. And I'd have broken the speed limit if I wasn't certain that I'd end up getting pulled over by some weird cop who'd do who knows what, probably after yelling that weird phrase at me. And I know that's probably what you're thinking at this point. Like, why not call the cops or drive to the town's sheriff's office or police department? Well, to put it straight and simple, I was terrified. The last thing I wanted to do was hang out in a place that was just so bizarrely hostile, so I tried to flee. And so after I saw the light had turned green, I put my foot down, staying within the speed limit, of course, and tried making my way to the town's western limits. I was still shaken by the guy attacking my car, but my escape was going well, so I was able to stay calm. But then as I was confident that I was going the right way, 2 teenage boys jumped out in front of my car so suddenly that I had to slam on the brakes. I yelled at them to get the hell out of the street, but then I'm pretty sure you can guess what they did next. Yeah, they pointed their fists at me in that same devil horn style salute, and then they each began yelling von hinnen gangen. Not quite in unison, but very loudly. I remember screaming in frustration as I backed up and tried to drive around them, but then they moved aside and blocked me again. I yelled at them for a second time to move out of the way, but they just kept on yelling those damned words at me with these big crap-eating grins on their faces. I knew I'd have to turn around and find another way out of town. I just couldn't run those boys over either. I wanted to, don't get me wrong, but you see my point. But then as I looked behind me to check if the street was clear, I saw a third boy running at my driver's side window, and he's carrying this big old stick in his hands. I knew what he was about to do with it, so I did my best to speed up my attempts to turn around. But I was too slow, and he was too quick. But he wasn't just quick. That kid was strong too, because when he sent that stick smashing into my window, it caused the glass to actually crack in a spiderweb pattern. Now I screamed, and the boys laughed, and then honestly I didn't try to run them over, but they were forced to duck out of the way as I put my car into drive and put my foot down again. They didn't just quit it either. They chased my car, running as fast as they could until I reached the town limits, and I kept looking up into my rear view, watching them run right down the middle of the street. A couple of grown-ups were walking around, but they didn't seem to pay any attention at all to those boys as they ran screaming behind my car. I distinctly remember yelling, "What the F is wrong with this town?" as I finally hit the open highway, trying desperately to stop from breaking down completely. And I think I lasted about 5 or 6 miles tops before I pulled over to the side of the road and burst into tears. It took a while before I was calm enough to drive again, but then I got back on the highway and I realized that I wasn't where I thought I was. It took a while to actually orientate myself, but when I did, I managed to get back on the road to Evanston. When I arrived about an hour later, I stopped and checked a map to see where the sheriff or police department was. I didn't want to ask any more strangers, I didn't want to risk it. I drove to the police department, and then after arranging to talk with an officer, he led me to some kind of interview room where I told him the whole story. I actually tried to omit the little detail about them shouting weird phrases at me because I knew that that would just make me sound crazy. But even so, the way I described the town and the way its people acted towards me, it had the officer raising his eyebrows on more than one occasion. When I was done, and I was practically begging him to do something, he asked if I was okay to wait for a while because he needed to go talk to the chief. I got ready to wait for a while, because stuff like that nearly always takes an annoyingly long amount of time, at least in my experience. But then no more than 5 minutes went by before the chief appeared in the department's waiting area and asked if he could speak with me. Now, I could tell just from the way he greeted me that it wasn't going to be good news, but hearing it was surreal to say the least. The chief said I wasn't the first person to fall afoul to what he called Germantown, and I probably wouldn't be the last either, because hating and shunning outsiders was practically a proud old tradition over there. And I told him about the weird phrase they've been yelling, the von hinnen gangen, which turned out to be some sort of archaic German way of saying, get the hell out of here, as well as the attacks. The chief said that I was lucky not to get worse, because he'd known folks to need medical treatment after accidentally driving through there. Germantown wasn't the place's actual name, its occupants called it something else. But the whole being mean to outsiders thing started way back in the 1800s, I guess, after someone brought some plague into the town. They were already super old school religious and had a lot of superstitions, so after that it became tradition to just sort of shoo away outsiders. I asked if it had happened before, and worse too. Why hadn't anything been done about it? I thought the answer would be a complicated one, but it wasn't, because all it boiled down to was a small town banding together and putting up a wall of silence. The most the county had ever been able to pin on anyone was a disorderly conduct charge, because local law enforcement essentially refused to do anything about crimes perpetrated on outsiders. I could try to gather evidence for litigation, but without witnesses, there wasn't a case. And so according to the police chief there, the best thing that I could do for myself was to get in my car, keep on driving to wherever I was going, and just try to forget it ever happened. Now, anything else would only bring on more trouble. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, call me naive, but I thought that there was a common law in this country that meant that people couldn't just get away with stuff like that. But obviously I was wrong. The chief said everyone in Evanston always avoided Germantown like the plague, or if they did drive through it, they made damned sure not to do so with a low gas gauge, and they never, ever stopped. Now, I made it to my aunt's funeral, but I never did buy that RV. I ended up flying back to Newark, grabbing my things, and then flying back to Sacramento to live with my dad. There's a whole other story to that, but let's just say that what I experienced in Germantown had me reassessing what was important in life. We kind of normalize cities as being dangerous places, or just accept certain neighborhoods or streets being tantamount to a sort of no-go zone. And I guess I didn't realize that that same thing applies to small towns in the middle of nowhere, too. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much for listening, friends. Oakley dokley. See you next time. Yeah.